Alright, continuing, I think. So, we're around lecture 5 or 6, and well, I guess I could know that if I was on the right page. But anyway, it doesn't really matter. Lecture 6. And we're talking about lightning and such.
And if the potential difference becomes too low, then the process stops. You have to wait now for the cloud to charge up again, and then lightning will strike again. And that can take anywhere from maybe 4, 5, 10, 20 seconds. And then you get another lightning bolt.
Probably in a different location.
The study of this process, of the step leader and of the return stroke, can be done with a camera which is called the Boyer's camera. Let me first explain to you in detail, in principle, how it works. If this is the area on the film that is exposed by your lens, suppose that I move the film at a very high speed to the left, and suppose the step leader comes down, and I see some light from the step leader, then I may see on the film this, some light. And from here to here would then be the 5 milliseconds which it takes the step leader to go from the cloud to the earth. Now the return stroke takes place with a way higher speed, and so I see a tremendous amount of light because there's a lot of light in the return stroke, and of course this is very steep because it goes 100 times faster up than the step leader came down. And so you can measure these times, and so you can get the speed of the return stroke. And then
So you're getting a picture of pieces of its progression. So it's really a straight line, but the lens will be moving, so it'll be in different locations.
Later in time, maybe 30, 40 seconds later on the film, you may see another return stroke, and you may see another one. And so you can see then how long the time was between the return strokes, and you can also calculate their speeds. With the real camera, it's not really the film that is moving, but it is the lens that is moving. And the way these pictures are taken, and I will show you one, is if this is the photographic plate, then it is the camera that moves over the plate with a very high speed, about 3,000 revolutions per minute. And so you would get this information then not horizontally, but you get it spread out over the film. But you get the same information, you can calculate speeds and times. During the past decade, new forms of lightning have been discovered which occur way above the clouds, way higher up. Red colors have been seen, red sprites they are called, and also blue jets. The light is very faint, and it occurs only for a very short amount of time. It's very difficult to photograph. I have not been able to get good slides for today. However, I did see some pictures on the web, and when you log into the web, when you visit the web 802, which you should, then I give you directions how to access slides, pictures of the red sprites and of the blue jets. The physics of that is not very well understood. It's being researched very heavily, but it's way above the cloud. There are also other forms of...
I'm betting it's not being researched all that heavily, but whatever.
Electric breakdown of discharge. They are different in the sense that it's not an individual spark, but there is a continuous flow of charge. It occurs always from very sharp points, so there is a continuous current actually going on. And some of that you may have seen, but you may not remember. When we use the carbon arc here, we had 2 carbon arcs, 2 carbon rods, and we had a potential difference between them, and we got a discharge between them which caused a tremendous amount of light, which we used for projection purposes. So a carbon arc discharge is such a form of discharge whereby you have a continuous current. It's not just sparks. If you take grass or trees, or brushes for that matter, where there is thunderstorm activity, they can go into this discharge at their sharp tips. And we call this brush discharge. We call it St. Elmo's fire. It's all the same thing. It's also called corona discharge. I normally call it corona discharge. It produces light because the ions, when they neutralize, produce light. Heat makes sound, pressure, and so you can hear this cracking noise of the corona discharges. An airplane that flies or a car that drives, there's friction with the air, and any form of friction can charge things up. And so it's not uncommon at night that you can see this corona discharge from the tip of the wings of an airplane. I've also seen it from cars, corona discharge from cars, which charge themselves up simply by driving through the air. The airflow would charge them up. You can hear it cracking, and you can see it sometimes. If it's dark enough, you see some light. In general, it's bluish light.
Didn't work.
Something completely on the side, going back to the lightning bolts.
Yes. So the important thing is to better understand what the difference is between the fact that when electricity moves through a current and it does it correctly versus doing it some other way that produces light. So you could argue that the light is evidence of something a little more violent happening than just the process of ions being exchanged or electrons being exchanged. So clearly they're being exchanged in a manner that is too extreme for the atoms to handle, and this extra photons are being released because the electrons are being forced out of positions and allowing the pressure between them to escape. They're losing energy to produce light.
Bolts, the discharge, the moving electrons can cause radio waves. And these radio waves you can receive on your car radio. And all of you have experienced this. Driving around, lightning very far away, you can hear it on the radio. So that's telling you that there is lightning going on somewhere. After a thunderstorm, something that many of you may not have experienced, because in the cities there's always exhaust from cars that spoils everything. But when you're out in the country, after a thunderstorm, there's a very special smell in the air. I love it. And that's ozone. Oxygen 2, in lightning becomes oxygen 3. And oxygen 3 has a wonderful smell. And you can really smell that. It's very typical. I hope that most of you, sooner or later in life, will have that experience. Go to the country after a thunderstorm, and you can really smell this ozone. Let's now look at some slides. The first slide that you will see is a very classic slide made by Gary Ladd, Kitt Peak Observatory in Arizona. What I like about this is that these are the observatories, telescopes in the domes. And of course, when you're an astronomer, this is the kind of weather that you can do without. But nevertheless, it happens. You see here return strokes. The light is definitely due to the return strokes. It's very bright. These are step leaders that never made it to the Earth. And if a step leader doesn't make it to the Earth, you don't get a return stroke. And so the light, as you can see here, is much less. And what you think here is only 1 bolt is probably at least 10, 5 to 10, maybe 15 flashes, return strokes. All right, next slide, please. Here you see the result of a voice camera exposure. For those of you who are sitting in front, you can recognize maybe the Empire State Building here. And the Empire State Building is hit here by lightning at the lightning rod's sharp point. That's where you expect it to be hit. This is not...
So you had to have that part. So it's not exactly what he said, in the sense that these are obviously the step leaders look a lot like the things shooting back up in terms of the patterns, very similar. So they're not broken in any pieces. So they were obviously it was enough time to capture the image without having to capture it in pieces.
Taken when the camera was rotating. This is just the exposure the way you and I would see it. Not moving camera, but here you see the result of the rotating voice camera. This is the same flash. So here you see the return stroke. The light from the step leader is too faint. Can't see that. So here's the return stroke. And then this time separation, maybe 30 or 40 milliseconds. See another stroke. You see another one and another one. So there are 6 here. Looks like you see a double one here. And so you have 6 or 7 of these return strokes. And this is the way that you can study.
Okay, so it can't take a picture of the step leader things. Okay. Okay.
Speeds and how much charge actually is exchanged between these between the clouds, and in this case the Empire State Building. The next slide shows you a corona discharge in the laboratory. This is a high voltage supply. There's a very sharp tip here at the end, the sharp point. And here you see not individual sparks. You don't call this lightning, but this is what you would call the St. Elmo's fire. The corona discharge is bluish light. And in fact, when you are close to this power supply, you can also smell the ozone. It also produces locally ozone. And you can see it. If you make it dark in the laboratory, you can see some bluish light.
Yeah, so the blue indicates that the, that's another signal that this is sort of a high pressure thing, high voltage. And because it has to be, the electrons have to be close to each other to create the high frequency light. The thing I'm just curious about is what would happen if you turned it upside down, because obviously this is seeking ground, you would expect, unless they have some kind of charged plate or something. It's seeking the ground, and so just be wondering if the pattern would be different if it's upside down, pointed towards ground. Just curious.
I was a graduate student. I had to build power supplies, high voltage power supplies, and I remember that my soldering job was not a very good job. That means when I take the solder iron off, then I could draw a little sharp point to solder, and that would then later cause me problems with corona discharge. It means I would have to redo the soldering so that the radius of the solder joint would become larger, so no sharp points. That's enough for the slides right now. Benjamin Franklin invented the lightning rod. His idea was that through the lightning rod, you would get a continuous discharge, corona discharge, between the cloud and the building, and therefore you would keep the potential difference low, and so there would be no danger of lightning. And so he advised King George III to put these sharp points on the royal palace and on powder houses, ammunition, storage places for ammunition. There was a lot of opposition against Franklin. They argued that a lightning rod will only attract lightning, and that the effect of the discharge, lowering the potential difference, would be insignificant. But nevertheless, the king followed Franklin's advice.
So, I mean, it's interesting just to think about the fact that they had already figured out that you could drain electricity through this more passive discharge. So essentially preventing a spark by pulling the voltage difference through all these, through these little pathways rather than one big pathway. Something like that. I didn't think. I thought Franklin basically was just saying let it hit the rod instead of the building, and then we'll just run the rod to ground, and then there's no harm, no foul. Just create a path for the lightning. I didn't think he was that advanced to think that you could drain the energy so there wouldn't be lightning.
And after the sharp rods, the lightning rods were placed, there was a lightning bolt that hit one of the ammunition places, a pearl fleet, but there was very little damage. And so we now know that on the one hand, the discharge is indeed insignificant. And so the opposition was correct. And in fact, you do attract lightning, unlike what Franklin had hoped for. However, if your lightning rod is thick enough that it can handle the high current, which is 10,000 or 100,000 amperes, then the current will go through the lightning rod, and therefore there will not be an explosion. It will not hit the building, so it will be confined to the lightning rod. And so it worked, but for different reasons than Franklin had in mind, but he had the right intuition. He was a very great scientist, a great statesman, and so his lightning rod survived up to today.
So it's just curious, like I said, thinking about it, that maybe you could create some sort of Tesla coil on a lightning rod or something to make the rod a lot more attractive and kind of guarantee that the lightning will hit it. Something like that. It seems that should be possible.
Now I want to return to the Van de Graaff and show you some of the things that we have discussed. And the first thing that I would want to do is create some sparks. I run the Van de Graaff, and I will approach it with this small sphere, small radius, and as I come closer and closer, the electric field will build up here, and then I would predict that if sparks fly over, that they will go between the Van de Graaff and this sphere. The sphere is grounded, and so any current that will flow not through Walter Lewin, but will go through the ground. So there's no danger that anything will happen to me. At least not yet. You already hear some cracking noise. It means there are already sparks flying around inside there. It's very hard to avoid. There are always some sharp edges in there that we cannot remove. This is not an ideal instrument. But I still think I will be able to show you some sparks by coming closer. There we go. So what you think is only one spark may well be several, like these return strokes.
That's kind of interesting, just because the frame rate is low. So some of them you don't see. We hear the sound, but you don't see them because the frame rate's not quick enough. So it's on the frames that are missing is the light. It's kind of interesting.
The way I described was lightning. So what you're seeing here now is...
You didn't see those last two at all. It's like they're on frames that they're just missing from the video. So that's kind of interesting.
That the electric field locally has become larger than 3 million volts per meter, and then you go into this discharge phenomenon that we described, and that gives you the lightning. What I will do now is I would like you to experience, although it may not be so fascinating for you, to experience a corona discharge between a very sharp point that I have here, extremely sharp, and the Van de Graaff. And the only way that I can convince you that there is indeed going to be a discharge between this point and the Van de Graaff is by approaching the Van de Graaff, and this cracking noise that you hear now will disappear. And the reason why it will disappear...
Okay, so the cracking noise is being caused because there's surface irregularities that are creating little high voltage points where it's discharging through those, and you're hearing a little bit of a cheap lightning, a corona discharge inside the Van de Graaff. And so he's basically going to create an even more corona discharge. So it's going to lower the voltage of the Van de Graaff. And so then the discharge inside is going to end because now the voltage difference inside the Van de Graaff has been lowered because he's draining it, essentially.
Is that if I get a corona discharge between the tip and the Van de Graaff, it will drain current, it will lower the potential, and so that cracking noise will disappear. So the sparks which are now flying over won't all fly over anymore. You will not be able to see the light. There's too much light here, although I can probably see at the tip here this blue light. So I'm going to approach the Van de Graaff now. It's almost as if I had a lightning rod, and I'm not worried at all, because if any current starts flowing, it goes through this rod, which is like a lightning rod to the earth. So I'm not worried at all. I just am very brave, very courageous, approaching the Van de Graaff, and I want you to listen to that cracking noise. That cracking noise will disappear when I'm going to draw a current through this sharp point. Oh boy, there I go. And the cracking stops. And I can actually see here some glowing discharge, bluish. It will be impossible for you to see. I can come closer, I'm not worried. And so I'm draining charge now off the Van de Graaff, thereby lowering the potential of the Van de Graaff. And so these crazy sparks that occur here can no longer occur. Now they will. Can you hear them? And now you can't. If I were crazy, then I would develop a corona discharge between the Van de Graaff and myself. One way I could do that is by approaching it with my fingertips, as I mentioned earlier, but that may be a little bit too dangerous because I may draw a spark, which is the last thing that I would want today. However, a coronal discharge using these tinsels may be less dangerous. So I get a continuous flow of current, which now unfortunately doesn't go through the lightning rod, but now it goes straight through my body. And I can assure you that I can feel that. It's probably a very low current, it may be only a few microamperes, but it's not funny, it's not pleasant. But anything for my students, what the hell. But there we go. Yeah. You see the tinsels? I'm now in a corona discharge, and I feel the current through my fingers. It's continuous discharge now. This is St. Elmo's fire. You can't hit... Ah, that was a spark. Boy, you got something for your $27,000.
Doesn't really stop the noise, so he's not draining very much. So the tinsels are kind of guaranteeing it's a very little amount of current that he can pull through. It's enough resistance, so it's not draining nearly as much as the little metal tip.
Oh man. Okay. So you saw both corona discharge and you saw sparks. Boy, you were luckier than the first class, by the way. Clearly, lightning can be dangerous. Lightning can cause a fire. It can explode fumes. If you gas your car, just the flow of gasoline can charge up the nozzle. Friction can charge things up, that's why the nozzle is always grounded, because a spark would cause a major explosion. If you fill a balloon with hydrogen, then the flow of hydrogen is friction, can charge up the balloon, and a spark can then ignite the hydrogen. And this has led to a classic tragic accident. It's a long time ago. but it's so classic that I really have to show this to you. Hitler was very proud of his large airships. They're named after Graf Zeppelin. The Germans called them the Zeppelins. We called them dirigibles or blimps. And one of the largest one that...
The Hindenburg story. He doesn't really need this. Unless he's going to really explain it, which probably isn't going to do.
Hitler Germany ever built was the Hindenburg, 803 feet long, and 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen. And the Germans couldn't fill their Zeppelins with helium because they didn't have helium. And the Americans were not going to sell them helium for very good reason. And so they had to fill them with hydrogen. And so the Hindenburg, which was the name of this Zeppelin...
It's amazing that you have something 800 feet long. I mean, that's, 300 yards or something. And only carries 50 people. I mean, it just doesn't seem very practical. They don't go very fast.
Came over in May 1937, and when it arrived at Lakehurst in New Jersey, it started a gigantic fire. It came over in 35 hours, transatlantic, and you see here the explosion, May 6, 7:25 in the afternoon. There were 45 passengers on board, and 35 died in this fire. The speculation was that this may have been sabotage. It's still quite possible, although the official inquiry board concluded that it was St. Elmo's fire, that as the ship moored on this mast here, that a spark flew over, and that caused the explosion, the fire. And this was the end of the dirigibles for Germany. Napoleon, also not the nicest man on earth, had a suspicion when many of his soldiers got sick in Egypt that this was the result of marsh gas. And they suspected that this bad air that they could smell when they were near marshes, that was the cause of the disease. Bad air in French is malaire, and so they called the disease malaria. And so the way that they tested the air to make sure that the soldiers wouldn't get malaria was to build a small gun, which was like so. This was a conducting barrel, and they would let some of this marsh gas in the gun and put a cork on here, close it off, and here was a sharp pin. This pin was completely insulated from the barrel, conducting barrel, and then they would put some charge on here so that the spark would fly over there. It's really the precursor of the spark plug that we have in our cars. It's no different. And so if indeed there was then this marsh gas in there, there might be an explosion, and that was a warning then that there may be danger for the soldiers. Well, this morning I was walking through the building.
I don't know, this is kind of a silly way to explain something kind of simple, but whatever. You'd think Napoleon would have figured out it was mosquitoes, but whatever.
I was in lobby 7, and I smelled it was a funny smell. And I was just wondering whether perhaps, who knows, at MIT anything can happen, whether there was some gas there that shouldn't be there. And so I brought my my special gun, which is here, which is built after Napoleon. And you see here this little sphere, and I opened up the cork here, and I let some of that air in building 7, and then I decided that you and I will do the test and see whether perhaps there was some gas there that may cause some danger. So I would have to cause a discharge then inside the barrel here. I can try to do that by combing my hair, but that may not be sufficient amount of charge. So I can always make sure that there will be a spark inside that gun and use this disc, which has a little bit more charge on it. So here is then this lobby 7 gas inside. Now, of course, there's one possibility that there was nothing wrong with the air, in which case you will see nothing. And there's another possibility that the air wasn't kosher enough, and that you may see here small gloop. And since it's going to be very small at best, you have to be very quiet, otherwise you won't hear anything. And so let's first try now with my comb. I have my comb here to see whether I can generate a spark inside this barrel. And that may not work because I'm not sure that I get enough charge on this comb. No, that doesn't work at all. Well, let's see whether we can use this instrument.
Comedy.
Well, I sure hope that we won't get malaria. See you tomorrow.
Alright. So anyway, yes, this is good stuff. Interesting. Useful. So, till the next time, and such, and so forth, and whatnot. Don't know what the next subject is, but we'll find out together. Yay!